Picture, for a moment, a village at the edge of somewhere old. A cobblestoned lane runs between timber-framed houses that lean gently into one another, tired, but not yet fallen. A church spire lifts through a low, colourless mist, and in the middle of the square there is a well, stone-lined, its rim softened with moss, grass pushing quietly up between the cobbles at its foot, its wooden cover long gone. Nobody uses this well anymore. Nobody has used it for a very long time. And when, at last, someone lowered a lamp into it, what the lamp showed was not water. There is something beneath the streets of London that nobody quite wants to say out loud. Not in the guidebooks, not on the tourist maps sold in the station, not in the polite histories read to school children. And yet, whenever the engineers dig, for a new railway, for a new tower, for a new tunnel beneath the river, they keep finding the same thing. Layers of the dead. 25 skeletons in a 5.5-meter shaft under a garden square in Farringdon. 40 skeletons stacked into a patch of ground scarcely larger than a small bedroom. Bones so tightly packed, the diggers said there was almost no soil between them at all. And inside their teeth, sealed there for something close to 700 years, a disease still recognizable by its name. So the question we will sit with tonight is a simple one. What did the scientists actually find beneath London's plague pits? And why does everyone who studies these places seem to come away a little quieter than they went in? We are going to walk very slowly through all of this. Through the shaft, and the pit, and the churchyard, and the tooth in the lab. There is no rush at all. We have a long, quiet night together, and the story is not going anywhere. The dead have been down there for centuries. They will keep for a few hours more, while we sit with them gently. So before we go any further, a small, quiet word. If you have found your way here because sleep will not come, you are exactly the person these videos are made for. If you would like more of them, you might consider subscribing. And the bell, if you want it, is a small, quiet thing. And if you feel like leaving a word in the comments before you drift, tell me where in the world you are right now, and what time it is where you are. I like to imagine the small map of us, a light on in Adelaide, a light on in Ohio, a light on in a flat in Glasgow, all listening to the same quiet voice at once. And now, gently, there is nothing on the screen you need to see. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. You can let the room go dark around you, and let the voice keep going without you. Falling asleep is not failing at this. Falling asleep is the whole point. That is what we are here for. That well we began with, the mossy rim and the dark water beneath it, the low grey sky above. Hold on to none of it. Let it be a mood, not a puzzle. We will not be climbing back down into it tonight. It was only a door, and we have already stepped through. To understand what is under London, we have to picture London when it was still very small. Not the London of glass towers and railway tunnels and Sunday markets. Not the London of black cabs and neon signs. The London before all of that. The one that fit inside its own walls, whose bells you could hear from the fields, whose river was crowded with small boats and small nets and small errands. That is where our story begins. Not in a laboratory, not in a construction pit, but in a city so much smaller than the one that now covers it, we would barely recognize the shape. Picture, then, a medieval London of perhaps 50 or 60,000 souls, packed tightly along the Thames, ringed by fields and orchards and grazing land. A city with parish churchyards where the dead were laid gently, one by one, with names, with prayers, with the quiet arithmetic of ordinary grief. That is the world into which the sickness came. That is the world that first had to invent the plague pit, because ordinary graves were not enough. So let us go there, slowly, and take our time. I want to begin somewhere very ordinary. A patch of grass in central London, a place you might walk past 100 times without noticing. There are many of these across the city, small parks, little squares, cobbled corners where the pigeons gather and the office workers eat their lunches from paper bags. And under a surprising number of them, if you dug straight down through the turf and the topsoil in the older ground beneath, you would eventually meet the dead. Not one or two of them, not a scattering, rows of them, layers of them, Whole hushed populations laid down centuries ago and never moved. To understand how that came to be, we have to picture the medieval churchyard, which was really a very modest thing. A fringe of soil around a parish church. Sometimes only a few paces wide. Every parish had its own small patch, its own gravedigger, its own quiet rhythm of arrivals. In an ordinary year, in an ordinary decade, it was enough. The dead came in ones and twos, at the pace at which a small community lets go of its people, and the ground kept up. Names were written in the parish register. Prayers were said. The arithmetic of grief was gentle, and it balanced. Then, in the summer of the year 1348, that arithmetic broke. The Black Death reached England that year, coming ashore in the southwest, and moving north and east through the countryside, with a speed that no one at the time had any language for. By the autumn it was in London. By the following spring it was everywhere. Chroniclers wrote of parishes losing whole streets in a week, of houses shuttered because there was no one left inside to open them, of bells ringing so often, and for so many that at last some churches simply stopped ringing them, because the sound had become unbearable, and in any case everyone already knew. The graveyards, which had served their small communities for centuries, were suddenly and completely not enough. And so a new kind of ground had to be found. The king's officials and the city authorities began setting aside emergency land. Fields on the edge of the city, meadows near monasteries, patches of open earth that had never before held the dead, and that in normal times would have grown barley, or grazed sheep, or lain quiet under a hedgerow. These places were consecrated in haste, sometimes with the barest of ceremonies, and opened to receive whoever came. These are what we now call plague pits. And it is important, I think, to say that phrase gently, because the words themselves sound harsher than the reality often was. A plague pit was not, in most cases, one great yawning trench. It was a scattering of new burial grounds, opened as they were needed, filled by rows of ordinary Londoners whose names, in the great majority of cases, were never written down anywhere. A baker, a weaver's daughter, a boy who ran messages between wharves, a widow who sold pins, all of them laid into unfamiliar soil, without the parish register, without the small stone, without the 100 small threads that ordinarily tied a Londoner to a particular corner of a particular churchyard. How many such pits were there? That is a question with no clean answer. Some sources suggest tens of them across the medieval and early modern city. Others, counting every recurrence of plague over the following 3 centuries, suggest the number may reach into the hundreds. The precise figure is simply not knowable. Records were lost. Fields were built over. Memories faded within a generation of the last shovel of earth. What we can say, softly and with some confidence, is that the ground under London holds what may be more anonymous dead per square mile than almost any other city in Europe. A quiet, unmarked population resting beneath the visible one. Some of these places are known. They are marked on old maps, remembered in the names of streets, noted in the careful footnotes of local historians. Many more are only guessed at, inferred from a line in an old parish register, or a rumour that outlasted the people who first told it, or an odd bend in a modern street that seems to acknowledge something the pavement will not say aloud. And here, if you will allow it, we drift for a moment into softer territory. Some Londoners have long said, and this is not history but it is a kind of folk memory, that the city itself remembers where its dead are, that a certain square resists being built on, that plans are drawn up and permissions sought, and then, for reasons that are always given as ordinary and practical, the building never quite happens, and the square remains a square. That a certain garden always smells faintly of damp earth, even in July, when everything else is dry. That a churchyard wall bends around something that is no longer there, following a shape the eye can no longer see. There is no science in this. There is only the way people talk about a place when they have lived on it for a long time. It is possible, of course, that some of these hunches sit above real ground and some do not. We may never know. It is enough for tonight to notice that the stories exist, and to let them exist, and to move on. Picture, then, a wet October morning in the city of London, a grey square hemmed in on all sides by tall buildings of glass and Portland stone. Plain trees dripping into the puddles, the sound of buses muffled by iron railings, a courier passing through on a bicycle, wheels hissing on the wet path, office workers cutting across the grass with paper cups. And beneath the manicured lawn, beneath the neat gravel of the path, beneath the shallow topsoil laid down by some polite Victorian gardener, layer after layer of forgotten Londoners. Not violently placed, not disrespected, simply laid down at speed, in a year when the ordinary ground had failed, and then, over the centuries, gradually forgotten by the surface above. And picture, if you will, the person whose work it was to receive them. A gravedigger, somewhere in the year 1348, standing at the edge of a fresh trench with a spade in his hand. His shoes are wet through. His arms ache in a way that has stopped being ache and become simply the shape of his arms now. He is looking at more work than one man can do in a life, and he knows it, and he begins anyway. There is no monument to him. There is no name. There is only the ground he opened, which is still there, quietly, under whatever has since been built above it. And picture one last thing, a hand pressing into wet clay soil, somewhere in the fields north of the medieval wall. The clay is cold. It gives back a coolness that feels older than the hand. That is really all a plague pit is, at the beginning. A patch of clay, and a decision, and a coolness in the palm of somebody who had to make it. The rest, the layers and the centuries and the buildings that rose above, all came after. We tend to think of the past as safely finished, as something sealed off, like a book we have closed and put on a shelf. But under a city as old and as continuously lived in as London, the past is not sealed at all. It is directly beneath us, at the depth of an outstretched arm, at the depth of a tube tunnel. And every so often, when the modern city needs to dig, whether for a new sewer, or a new station, or the foundations of a new tower, it meets the older city again, meets it not as a story, but as a physical fact, a skull turning up in a bucket, a row of bones neatly aligned east to west, a layer of dark, rich soil that the archaeologist recognizes at once, because they have seen it before, and they know what it means. What lies beneath these places, and why the ones who look for it come away quietly changed, is something we will return to, gently, in its own time. For now it is enough to know that one of these forgotten patches is not so forgotten anymore. It sits in the shadow of a modern building, in a square that thousands of office workers cross every day without knowing what is under their feet. In the year 2013, that ground was opened, carefully, deliberately, and it gave back an answer that no one had quite expected. That is where we should go next. I want to spend some time now on a square called Charterhouse. It is in the city of London, close to Smithfield, close to the Barbican, close to the old edges of the medieval town. If you have been to London, you may have walked past it without knowing. It looks like any other quiet garden square, with plane trees and iron railings, and benches where somebody might sit with a sandwich at lunchtime. It is not, in fact, any other quiet garden square. It is one of the places where the city keeps its oldest and heaviest secret, held just under the grass, held there for nearly 7 centuries, in a stillness that the traffic on the surrounding streets does nothing to disturb. The ground under Charterhouse Square is now widely believed by historians and archaeologists to lie over what medieval Londoners called the Pardon Churchyard. It was not a churchyard in the ordinary sense, not a slow accumulation of parishioners buried one by one over the generations. It was an emergency measure. It was set aside during the outbreak of 1348 to 1350, in those first terrible seasons of the Black Death, when the ordinary churchyards of London, the small green patches around each parish church, had become badly, painfully insufficient. There were simply too many dead, arriving too quickly, and the old arrangements of the city could not hold them. So new ground had to be opened, at the edges, in the fields, wherever a bishop or a king could grant it. For a very long time, the exact location of some of these emergency grounds was more a matter of tradition than of proof. Chroniclers had written about them in the 14th century. Antiquarians had speculated about them in the 17th and 18th. Maps had been drawn with careful dotted lines and question marks, but the ground itself had stayed silent, built over, paved over, forgotten in the ordinary way that cities forget. Charterhouse was long thought to be one of these grounds. But thinking is not knowing. It would take a shaft in the earth to turn thought into knowledge. That shaft came in March of the year 2013. Crossrail engineers, working on the enormous project of a new railway tunnel that would eventually become part of the Elizabeth Line, needed to sink a working shaft into the earth of Charterhouse Square. The shaft was 5.5 meters wide, a neat circle cut into the soil, ringed with scaffolding and lamps, and it went down into the grey London clay by careful stages. Above ground, black cabs turned at the corner of the square. A coffee cart steamed gently in the drizzle. Office workers crossed on their way to meetings, glancing at the hoardings without much curiosity. Because London is always digging something, somewhere, and the sight of a fenced-off works is one of the most ordinary sights in the city. Below, though, something less ordinary was happening. Archaeologists from the Museum of London had been placed on watching brief because the possibility of what lay beneath was known well enough to warrant caution. And at a certain depth, in the walls of that circular shaft, the soil changed. It darkened. It took on the character that trained eyes recognize at once, the character of ground that has held the dead. And then, quietly, the first bone appeared. The small, dry click of a trowel against something that was not stone and not clay. A lightness in the earth where a rib had once caught the air. A pause, and a photograph, and a note in a book. What they lifted from that shaft, in the end, were 25 skeletons. 25 men, women, and children laid carefully in the earth, oriented in the Christian manner, their bones in the ordered posture of a proper burial, rather than the tangled disorder of panic. Around them, mixed into the soil, were fragments of pottery, small pieces of glazed and unglazed medieval ware, and these fragments were the crucial thing. Pottery is one of the ways archaeologists tell time. The styles of the mid-14th century are well studied, well dated, and the sherds recovered from around these bones sat firmly in that window. The burials belonged, almost certainly, to the years of the Black Death itself. Not to a vague medieval past, but to that specific catastrophe of 1348 to 1350, which we have already seen entering England and unmaking the ordinary shape of London life. Further analysis, done slowly and carefully in the months that followed, made the picture stranger and more layered. The ground at Charterhouse had not been used only once. There were, in the soil, 2 distinct periods of burial, 2 layers separated by decades of quiet earth. The first belonged to the initial pestilence of the late 1340s. The second belonged to a later outbreak in the 1430s, a return of the sickness that visited the city again in the reign of a different king, in a different London, and yet found the same ground waiting to receive its dead. 2 waves of a single long grief, 1 grave, and the soil holding both of them apart, and together at once. The Crossrail Archaeology project manager, a man named J. Carver, led much of the coordination of the excavation, and later spoke publicly about the scale and the importance of what had been found. He described it in the measured, understated language that archaeologists tend to prefer. But the understatement was itself a kind of testimony. This was not a small discovery. It was one of the clearest physical confirmations, in modern times, of where London had placed some of its Black Death dead. The Museum of London archaeology team recovered the bones with a care that would have astonished the original gravediggers, those exhausted men in the rain, who had worked with spades and torchlight, and no time. Now there were brushes, and trowels, and small wooden tools, and careful notation of position and orientation, and photographs from above, and grids drawn on paper. The dead were being lifted, one at a time, out of a hurry that had ended 600 years ago. Even now, though, scholars are careful about what they claim. It is not entirely certain that every single burial at Charterhouse belongs to a plague victim in the strict sense. Some of the bones may be the quieter dead of other years, ordinary parishioners who died in ordinary ways and were laid in ground that happened, later, to be used again in an emergency. Some may belong to that second wave rather than the first. The ground does not always sort its guests. It holds them all together, and it is left to us, patiently, with our tests and our layers and our fragments of pottery, to try to tell them apart, there will always be a soft margin of not knowing. That, in a way, is part of what makes the site feel the way it does. The certainty and the uncertainty rest in the same soil. Stand for a moment, in imagination, at the edge of that shaft as it was in the spring of 2013. Look down into the circular well of grey clay. See the lamps at the lip, casting a soft working light. See the archaeologists on their knees at the bottom, in high-visibility jackets over their warmer layers, moving with the slowness that the work requires. See, in the wall of the shaft, the dark band of older soil, the tell that gave the site away. And see, above it all, the ordinary square, the plane trees, the railings, the drizzle and the office workers who pass without knowing, because there is no reason they should know. The city keeps this well. It has always kept it. The shaft was, in its own quiet way, a brief opening of a door that is usually closed. The 25 brought up from Charterhouse were only the smallest hint of what lay in the larger ground around them. The Pardon churchyard, if it truly is the Pardon churchyard, would have held many more, thousands more, most of them still exactly where they were placed, undisturbed beneath the square and the streets that meet it. The shaft touched an edge, no more. The rest waits, as it has waited, in the same coolness of clay we felt earlier under an imagined hand. Charterhouse, though, was not the only ground the king's men opened in that terrible year. On the eastern edge of the city, closer to the river, closer to the tower, another burial ground was already being prepared, in a more deliberate and more official way. And this one, when the archaeologists eventually reached it, told a stranger and quieter story than the shaft in the square. Move now with me to the east, down toward the river, toward a stretch of ground that would one day become the Royal Mint, but that in the winter of 1348 was still open land, a rough and useful field. Close enough to the city walls to be reached by cart in a morning, and far enough away from the crowded parishes to be dug and dug again without much complaint from those who lived nearby. It is a piece of London that most modern feet pass without thinking. A cluster of buildings, a road, a corner near the tower. Yet beneath it lies one of the largest known plague cemeteries in Europe, a quiet and enormous archive of the first great wave of the sickness. The place is called East Smithfield, not to be confused with the older Smithfield to the northwest, which had its own reputation for markets and for fires. East Smithfield lay outside the Eastern Gate, near the river, on land that would in later centuries be given over to the Royal Mint, the great institution where the coin of the realm was struck and stored. Long before the Mint, though, the ground had another purpose. It was chosen, in that first shocked year of the pestilence, to hold the dead the parish churchyards could no longer take. We can say this much with confidence, because the paperwork of medieval kings, imperfect as it is, does not entirely fail us here. The king at that moment was Edward III, born in 1312, on the throne since he was a boy of 14, and by 1348, a man in the vigorous middle of a long reign. He was a warrior king, remembered for his campaigns in France, for the founding of the Order of the Garter, for a court that liked pageantry and cloth of gold. He was not, by temperament, a quiet man. Yet when the sickness came to his capital, he did what a competent medieval king did in a catastrophe. He gave orders. He arranged for land. He directed, through his officers, that the dead of the pestilence were to be given proper and consecrated burial, in suitable ground, at a suitable distance from the crowded lanes. Charterhouse, which we have already walked beside, was one of those grounds. East Smithfield was another, and by all the evidence, one of the largest. The chroniclers of the time speak, in their varied words, of great fields opened for the dead, of ground blessed hurriedly by bishops and priests, so that the burials might be counted as Christian, even when everything else about them was strange. The exact language shifts from one manuscript to another, and modern historians rightly paraphrase rather than quote too tightly. But the meaning is steady enough. The king wanted the dead in ground that was holy. He wanted, in the face of a disaster no one understood, the shape of ordinary faith to be preserved. The Museum of London Archaeology, which we may as well simply call MOLA, excavated East Smithfield in a careful and systematic way in the later decades of the 20th century. What they found there is what makes the sight so quietly astonishing. It was not a small emergency plot. It was a vast one. Estimates of the number of individuals buried there run into the thousands, and even the portion the archaeologists could reach yielded hundreds of skeletons in a state that allowed close study. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the great treasuries of information about the first wave of the Black Death anywhere in the world. And here comes the surprise. The burials were not chaotic. They were not tumbled in. They were not thrown together in the way that later paintings and later imaginations like to picture. The excavators at East Smithfield found rows, long, careful rows of bodies, aligned east to west in the Christian tradition, so that on the last day, as the theology of the time held, the dead might rise facing the returning light. Some were laid head to toe to fit more into the same trench, but even that fitting was done with an evident logic. There was a plan. There were people at the edge of the trench making decisions. There were hands, in that terrible winter, still trying to keep the shape of a proper burial, when almost everything else was falling away. Historians have argued, and still argue, about what those neat rows really mean. Some have suggested that they show what the earliest weeks of the outbreak looked like, before the numbers became overwhelming, when there was still time and still labor, and still enough grief left over to lay each body straight. Others have proposed that the neatness was itself a kind of ritual, a stubborn holding on to the form of Christian burial, precisely because everything else about the dying was so far outside the ordinary. If you cannot give a person a full requiem, a full family gathering, a full graveyard plot, you can at least give them an orientation. You can at least give them a line. We will not settle the argument here. The bones say what they say. We listen, and we let the meaning stay a little open. Try, if you will, to imagine the field itself in the winter of 1349. The ground would have been hard, half frozen at the surface, softer where it had been recently turned, breath fogged in the cold air of the men working there. The trenches had already been opened in advance, dug in long rectangular runs, the earth heaped in low walls beside them. Wagons arrived in a slow procession from the lanes of the city, wheels creaking, drawn by tired horses whose breath also steamed. In the wagons, wrapped shapes, some in linen, if linen could be found, some in whatever cloth the household still had, some by the end in almost nothing at all. The wrapped shapes were lowered by rope, or handed down, or simply passed from one pair of hands to another. And then, at the edge, a priest, standing with a small book open against the wind, his hands cold, his knuckles reddened, his voice hoarse from repetition. He said the same words again and again and again, in Latin mostly, the syllables familiar enough that they no longer needed thinking. A blessing over each body, or over a row at a time when a row was all that could be managed. A cross traced in the air. A brief pause. The next wagon. The next rope. The next descent. 600 years later, an archaeologist knelt in the same ground with a soft brush and a trowel, and photographed what she found. The photographs from East Smithfield are among the quiet treasures of British archaeology. Pale bones in dark brown earth. Long rows still visible after all that time. Skulls turned in the same direction as they had been laid. Ribs curving above the pelvis in the neat regularity of an anatomical drawing. It is a strange thing to look at those photographs and understand that no one in 1349, kneeling at the edge of a trench with cold hands and a book, imagined that anyone would ever look. The care they took was not for the camera of the future. It was for the dead themselves, and for the God the diggers still believed was watching, in a year when it must have seemed that God was watching from a great distance. That is part of what makes East Smithfield feel the way it does. The care is legible, the order is legible, the scale is legible too, and the scale is enormous, and the two things do not comfortably fit together in a single thought. Thousands of dead in careful rows, a field of the fallen tidied, a king's order carried out under conditions that must have made every step of it feel like more than the workers could bear. There is something in that image, the trench and the rows and the priest, that returns us to a question worth sitting with for a while. What did it actually look like deep inside? One of these pits, when the ground was open and the city was afraid, when the rows had reached their limit and another layer had to begin above them. For that, We will need to go down a little further, into the layered inside of a plague pit, and see what the diggers saw when they looked in. There is a phrase that appears in the Museum of London's commentary on the Black Death pits, and it stays with everyone who reads it. Bodies, 5 deep. Not 1 layer of the dead, not 2. 5, it is the kind of phrase that has to be read twice before it settles. And once it settles, it does not leave. The words are plain. The image behind them is not. 5 layers of human beings laid, one above the other beneath the same rectangle of soil, in the same trench, in the same summer, under the same low grey sky, over the same London. The archaeologists who read these strata describe them almost like the pages of a book, a dark organic layer, faintly interrupted by a paler capping of drawn soil, then another dark layer, then another capping, then more, 5 chapters deep in some places, thinner in others, but always the same pattern of alternation, a layer of the dead, a thin skin of earth, another layer of the dead, another skin of earth. It is the geology of grief, if such a thing can be said to exist, and it is written into the ground beneath parts of the city, in a hand so patient and so consistent that it can only have been the work of many people over many days, following the method that had somehow become routine. The routine looked in outline like this. A trench was opened, long and rectangular, cut down to a depth that could hold more than the first day's dead. The bodies arrived in wrapped bundles, or in the coarse cloth that had been the best a household could manage, and they were lowered rather than dropped. They were laid in most cases rather than tumbled. Alignment was preserved as much as the density allowed. Heads at one end, feet at the other, arms folded or resting along the sides, the small, careful gestures of Christian burial repeated as far as the crowding would permit. Then the first layer would be complete, and a thin capping of soil would be drawn across it, sealing it under a pale hand's breadth of London earth. And then the next layer of the dead would begin. It is the second layer, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth that make the mind pause. Because by then the trench was no longer a burial in any ordinary sense. It was becoming something else. A stratum, a structure. A page turned, and turned again, and turned again, above the same accumulating story. And still the bodies were laid, not thrown. That is the detail that keeps returning. Even in the fourth layer, even in the fifth, the alignment was preserved. Heads still turned the same way. Arms still folded where hands could still fold them. The people doing this work had not stopped believing that the dead deserved a certain shape. Among the details the osteologists have noted, one in particular is quietly heavier than the others. Children, whose bodies were smaller, were sometimes tucked into the spaces between adults, not laid apart, not gathered into a separate row, placed instead into the gaps that the larger bodies left, into the space beside a folded knee, above a resting shoulder, in the hollow beside a half-turned head. A small bundle fitted into the space where a small bundle would fit. The geometry of it is almost domestic, and that is what makes it so difficult to sit with, because the geometry belongs to a family bed or to a cradle set beside a parent's arm. And here it is being repeated in the floor of a plague trench, by people who have run out of room and have not run out of care. It is tempting, reading that, to reach for cruelty as the explanation. 5 layers of dead, children packed into the gaps. It sounds, described plainly, like the language of atrocity. But those who have studied these graves most closely say something different, and they say it carefully. They suggest that the arrangement was, in its own strange way, an act of tenderness. The gravediggers were placing the small bodies where they would fit. They were not throwing anything away. They were, given what they had, still trying. That is an interpretation, and it is offered as one, and we may never know the full weight of what the people at the edge of those trenches felt as they worked. But the physical evidence, the alignment preserved even at the 5th layer, the small skulls set into the hollows rather than into the spoil heap, does seem to argue in that direction. The care did not stop when the numbers overwhelmed. It only bent to fit them. Picture a trench in 1349 seen from above, a rectangle open to the sky, longer than it is wide, its floor patterned with pale shapes wrapped in coarse cloth. Someone at the rim is lowering another small bundle on a length of rope, and someone at the bottom is receiving it, adjusting it, laying it down where it needs to go. There is very little talking. The work has a rhythm by now. Above the trench, the light is the ordinary light of an English afternoon, and the air holds the ordinary smells of summer in a city, and neither of those ordinary things quite belongs to what is happening below the ground. And then picture the face of a gravedigger who has been at this for 6 weeks, and has stopped counting. His hands know what to do. They have known for a long time now. His mind is elsewhere, somewhere kinder, or somewhere emptier, or somewhere it does not have to look at the shape of the day. He receives the next bundle. He kneels. He places it in the space it fits. He straightens. He waits for the next. His back aches in a low, constant way that he has stopped noticing, in the way one stops noticing a sound that never ends. He will go home this evening, and he will eat something, and he will sleep, and in the morning he will come back to the trench, and the trench will still be here, and there will still be more. There is a small moment that must have happened many times, though no chronicler wrote it down because it was too small and too common to record. The moment when a child's body was laid between two larger ones. A pause, perhaps. A hand rested briefly, in what might have been a blessing, or might only have been the placing of a child, on the crown of the small skull. Then the work went on. There is no way to know how often that pause occurred, or how long it lasted, or what the person who paused was thinking, but the shape of the evidence, the way the small bodies were fitted rather than flung, suggests that such pauses did happen, that there were people in those trenches who could not do this work without at least sometimes stopping for the length of a breath. The bones themselves, examined centuries later, are quiet on most subjects, but eloquent on a few. No trauma is evident on most of the skeletons from these Black Death layers. These were not people who died of violence. Their bones carry the ordinary marks of ordinary lives, worn teeth from bread ground on stone that left a little grit behind, healed fractures from the small accidents of work and childhood, the faint signatures of hard labor along the shoulders and the spine, the small histories that any life leaves in its own skeleton, if a life is lived long enough to leave them. But no cuts, no blade marks, no sign of the fight that some later imaginations, reaching for drama, would want to give them. These were people who fell ill and did not recover, and were carried, and were laid down. That is what the ground held, in those layered trenches on the edges of the medieval city. That is what the diggers laid down in the summer of 1349, and into the year that followed, and that is what the thin cappings of soil sealed away above them, 1 page at a time, until the trench was full and could be closed. And for 6 centuries, the ground kept it. The layers stayed in the order they had been placed. The small bodies stayed in the hollows they had been fitted into. The alignment held. But in our own time, we have found ways of asking those bones questions the grave diggers could never have imagined asking. Questions the priests at the trench edge would not have known were possible. Questions that require not a rope and a trowel, but a laboratory. And that is where the ground begins, at last, to answer. Come with me now into a laboratory. Not a dramatic one. Nothing like the films, with their blue light and their urgent music, and their heroes leaning over microscopes at midnight. A quiet, well-lit room somewhere in London, or in a research institute in Germany, or in a genetics department in the north of England. A table, a tray, a single medieval tooth. That is all. A tooth taken with great care from a jaw that has lain in the ground since the summer the trench at Charterhouse Square was closed. A small dark object, no larger than the tip of a finger, set on a clean surface under a clean light, waiting for someone to ask it a question. The person who lifts it is wearing gloves. The gloves are pale, and the tooth against them looks even darker than it is, stained by centuries in the London clay. The room hums, faintly, the way such rooms do. Filtered air moving through vents. A centrifuge whirring somewhere along a bench. A fluorescent panel overhead, giving off its steady, unshadowed glow. In the next room, someone is speaking quietly, and a kettle has just clicked off, and a chair scrapes. This is the ordinary background of modern science. There is nothing ceremonial about it, and yet what is about to be asked of this small brown object is a question no one, in all the centuries between, has been able to put to it. The tooth was chosen for a reason. Enamel is the hardest substance the human body makes. It is denser than bone, more resistant to the slow chemistry of soil, and it protects, inside itself, a small chamber where the pulp once lived. In life, that pulp was fed by tiny vessels, and through those vessels flowed the blood. And in the blood, if a person was sick at the moment of death, floated whatever it was that had made them sick. When the person died, and the soft tissues began their long return to the earth, the enamel closed over that chamber like a lid on a sealed jar. And it held. Through 6 centuries of damp London ground, through the shifting of layers above it, through the growth of a monastery garden, and the walking of feet, and the laying of pipes, and the eventual arrival of a tunneling machine, the enamel held. And what it held, in a form scientists could still read, was a signature. After the Crossrail team lifted the 25 skeletons from the shaft at Charterhouse Square, samples were taken from the teeth of several of them. At least 4 of those individuals gave up, from the pulp chambers sealed inside their molars, the genetic traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. There it was, not folklore, not chronicle, not the strained accounts of frightened monks writing by candlelight. A fingerprint, a sequence of letters on a screen. The thing itself, or what remained of it, dried into the enamel of a jaw that had been closed for nearly 700 years. There is a moment, in stories about laboratories, that has been told so often it has become a small ritual of its own. The moment when the screen shows the sequence, and someone leans in, and the room goes quieter than it already was, and a voice says softly, "It's here." Whether it happened quite like that in the London plague studies, we cannot know. Science is usually less cinematic than that. The confirmation comes slowly, through repetitions and controls, through the careful ruling out of contamination. But somewhere in the process, there is always a first reading, and someone is always the first to see it. And whatever they say aloud, or do not say, the fact of the reading is the same. The bacterium that emptied the streets of London in the summer of 1348 had been found again, still legible, in the mouths of the people it had killed. The finding did more than confirm what the chronicles said. It settled, quite firmly, a question that had lingered for a long time. For centuries, historians had accepted that the Black Death was plague, but some had wondered. The speed of the spread across Europe, the details of symptoms in certain accounts, the seasonal patterns, all of it had, over the years, prompted a small number of researchers to ask whether the pestilence of the 14th century might have been driven, in whole or in part, by something else. Some other pathogen, a hemorrhagic fever perhaps, or an unknown viral illness, moving under the same name. It was a minority view, and a hedged one, but it existed. The teeth, when they were read, answered a large part of that question. The bacterium was there. Yersinia pestis had been in the blood of these Londoners at the hour of their deaths. And yet a quiet corner of the debate has not entirely closed. Some scientists still wonder whether more than one invisible thing may have been moving through the medieval city at the same time. A companion sickness, perhaps, riding alongside the main one, or slipping through the same weakened bodies and taking those the plague had already loosened. It is not a claim of conspiracy, only a careful noticing that human epidemics rarely arrive alone, and that the chronicles sometimes describe symptoms that do not sit tidily within any single modern diagnosis. The evidence keeps pointing firmly to plague. But the possibility of a second, quieter guest at the same table is one that a few researchers keep gently on the shelf. It is a small debate, conducted in careful journals, and it may never be fully settled. What is not in doubt is what the teeth showed next. In a separate study on remains linked to a later London mass grave, scientists recovered Yersinia pestis DNA from victims of the Great Plague of the year 1665. Different century, different burial ground, different Londoners, dressed in different clothes, dying in a different city, under a different king. And yet the fingerprint in the enamel was the same bacterium, the same organism, essentially, that had come ashore in England more than 3 centuries before. It had waited and returned and waited and returned And the sequence of letters on the modern screen was, in its essential shape, the sequence that had killed the people beneath the shaft as well. That is one of the strange gifts of this kind of science. It collapses time. A tooth from 1349 and a tooth from 1665, set side by side, tell you that the thing which emptied the medieval streets and the thing which emptied the Stuart streets were, at the microscopic level, close relatives. The city changed. The kings changed. The language changed. The buildings rose and fell and rose again. But the small round bacterium that arrived in a flea's gut and passed into a bloodstream and slipped from there into the pulp of a tooth kept its shape. And so the question that has drifted through these chapters, quietly the question of what scientists actually found beneath London's plague pits, has one of its clearest answers here. Not a treasure, not a curse, not a hidden chamber or a lost hoard. A signature sealed inside enamel, waiting to be read. A small piece of evidence that the sicknesses of the chronicles were real, that they were caused by a thing which can still be named, and that the naming of it, at last, is a kind of respect paid to the dead. Their killer had been anonymous to them. It is no longer anonymous to us. The gloved hand sets the tooth back into its tray. The tray goes back into its case. The case goes back onto its shelf. The laboratory hum continues, and somewhere in the next room the kettle is refilled, and the day moves on. The tooth has said what it came to say. The person it belonged to, whose name will never be known, has, through the smallest of doorways, given up one last piece of information about the hour of their death, and about the shape of the city's suffering, and about the invisible thing that walked through those streets in the summer of 1349. But Charterhouse was only one of the sites the modern city has opened. Under another part of London, under one of its busiest railway stations, another burial ground was waiting. Larger, longer used, stretching across nearly 2 centuries of the city's life. And in one tight corner of it, quite unbearably crowded, another kind of story was folded into the earth, waiting for a different set of tunnels to reach it. Anyone who has passed through Liverpool Street Station in London knows the sound of it. The rush of announcements over the loudspeakers, the clatter of wheeled luggage on tile, the tide of commuters moving in and out of the platforms in their coats and headphones, checking the boards, checking their watches, checking the time until the next departure. What almost nobody knows, as they cross the concourse with a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, is what lies directly beneath their feet. Not simply cables and pipes and the pale sinews of an old city's plumbing. Not simply the tunnels of the underground threading through the London clay. Beneath that station, in a quiet and enormous stillness, lies one of the largest burial grounds the city has ever kept. It is called, in the old records, the Bedlam Burial Ground. Its name reaches back to the notorious Bethlehem Hospital, the medieval institution founded to care for those the city called mad, and from whose shortened name the English language borrowed the word Bedlam itself, meaning uproar, meaning chaos, meaning a noise that no one can quiet. The burial ground associated with that hospital was in use from about the year 1569, and it continued generation after generation for at least 170 years. It received the patients of Bethlehem, yes, but it also received ordinary Londoners, people who lived and died outside the traditional parish system, people whose faiths or circumstances or poverty placed them a little to one side of the usual arrangements of church and churchyard. For 170 years, then, this piece of ground took the city's overflow, the unaffiliated, the dissenting, the forgotten, the unremembered, and by the time the modern engineers came for it, it had grown into something almost difficult to describe. When cross-rail excavations reached the site, archaeologists began to uncover skeletons in numbers that startled even those who had worked London soil for decades. Around 3,000 individuals, in the end, were lifted from that ground. An area, when mapped out, roughly the size of a football pitch, densely packed with the dead of many generations, stacked and interleaved, and set beside one another in the slow accumulation that only a very long-used cemetery can produce. Most of them had been buried in wooden coffins. The wood itself, in London clay, does not last. It softens and darkens and returns to the soil. But the iron nails remain. Small, corroded, still in their original positions, they trace the outlines of coffins long since vanished, like the pins of a dressmaker marking a pattern on cloth that has been washed away. Around the nails, in the soil, the archaeologists could still see the dark stain where the timber had rested, coffin-shaped shadows in the earth, rectangles of a darker color, holding within them the pale shape of a person. The excavation was among the largest archaeological operations in London's recent history. Teams worked in shifts in paper suits, under headlamps, their breath sometimes visible in the cool underground air, so that the remains could be lifted with proper care before the engineers moved through with the next stage of the tunnel. It was patient, careful, ordinary work. Brushes moving over shapes that used to be shoulders and jaws, trowels easing the clay away from the curve of a rib, notebooks filling with sketches and measurements. And above them, quite oblivious, the station continued its day. Fluorescent light on polished floor, the smell of coffee from the kiosks, the soft mechanical chime of the departure boards updating themselves. Thousands of feet passing, hour after hour, over a ground that was quietly being read. Not all of the dead of Bedlam had died in a hurry. Most, in fact, had not. Most were ordinary Londoners who had died of ordinary things, of illness, of accident, of old age, of the long, slow difficulties of a long, slow century. Their graves were laid out with a certain order. One coffin here, one coffin there, spaced as decently as the crowded ground would allow. But within this vast site, one particular feature stood out from all the rest, and it stood out because it was different in almost every way from the graves around it. It was a pit, a single pit, roughly rectangular, about 2 1/3 square meters in area, which is to say a patch of ground scarcely larger than the floor of a small bathroom. And into that patch of ground, in what must have been a very few days, someone had placed about 40 bodies. 40, in that small a space. The density is difficult to hold in the mind. Limbs interlocking with limbs. A skull resting against the curve of another's spine. Almost no soil between them. No coffins visible. No careful spacing. Just a tight, catastrophic geometry pressed down into the clay, and then sealed over, and then left, for nearly 5 centuries. Until the archaeologists arrived with their brushes and their lamps. Photographed from above, the mass grave has the strange, terrible beauty of a puzzle. A pattern of pale bone, the rounded shapes of skulls at odd angles, the long lines of femurs crossing one another. It is the shape of a moment when the ground had to be opened wide, and filled quickly, and closed again before the next arrival. Historians have looked at that little rectangle, and at the layers of soil around it, and at the fragments of pottery and pipe stems mixed into the fill, and they have come to a careful hedged conclusion. It is likely, they say, that this mass grave dates to a plague outbreak in the 16th century. The city suffered several. The great outbreak of 1563 carried away a substantial share of the population within its walls. Later waves followed. In 1593, in 1625, each of them enough to overwhelm the usual arrangements of the parishes. Which of these outbreaks put those 40 bodies into that pit is a matter historians still gently disagree about. The evidence points broadly to the 16th century. The precise year and the precise fever may never be settled. But the fact of it, the tight little rectangle of 40, tells us something plain. At least once, and probably more than once, in Bedlam's long service, something moved through the city fast enough that the usual decencies had to be set aside. The wooden coffins, so patiently marked out elsewhere in the site by their vanished timbers and their surviving nails, did not appear here. There had been no time. There had been no wood. There had been no capacity to give each person their own quiet rectangle of earth. The ground opened, and the ground received them all together, and the ground closed. This is the older sibling, in a sense, of what lay beneath the shaft at Charterhouse Square. Different century, different fever perhaps, different corner of the city, but the same underlying gesture, the same emergency choreography, in which the parish system falters and something more improvised takes its place, and a piece of ground briefly becomes a receiver for a wave of the dead. East Smithfield had done it in the 14th century. in a more organized fashion, under the king's direct order. Charterhouse had done it too, and here, at Bedlam, in a quieter and less official way, the pattern repeated. A rectangle 2 1/3 meters across. 40 people. A single hurried closing. The rest of the burial ground carries the ordinary weight of a long century's dying. Coffin shadows, iron nails, the bones of tradesmen and servants, and dissenters, and hospital patients, and stillborn infants, and the elderly. 3,000 quiet individuals, in a plot the size of a football pitch, lifted one at a time by careful hands, and recorded, and eased into cases, and taken away for study before the tunnel came through. Above them, the station has not paused. It cannot. The trains keep their timetables, the announcements keep their rhythm, the commuters keep their routes. But somewhere in the offices of the Museum of London, and in the notebooks of the archaeologists, and in the photographs of that tight rectangle taken from above, the ground beneath Liverpool Street has been quietly read, and it has quietly given up what it could. That tight corner, that pit of 40, belongs to one of London's earlier plague outbreaks. But the outbreak everyone remembers, the one whose name still carries a small shudder in the English imagination, came a full century later. That is the one we should sit with next. There is a year that Londoners, even now, know by number alone. 1665, the year of the Great Plague. The year the diarist Samuel Pepys walked through a city with the doors of the sick marked in red, and lived to write it down. He kept his coded journal by candlelight in a house not far from the river, and he noted, in that flat and observant way of his, the small terrors of ordinary errands. A friend seen well, 1 week and gone the next. A tavern where the drawer had died since he last visited. A street he no longer walked down because he had heard what had happened in it. His diary is not the whole of the outbreak, of course. It is one man's shuttered window onto it. But that window has stayed open, in a sense, for more than 3.5 centuries. And through it, we can still glimpse the shape of the season. The Great Plague ran from 1665 into 1666, and by the time it had loosened its grip, more than 100,000 Londoners were dead, perhaps a quarter of the city's population. The number is so large that it flattens against the mind and refuses to be felt all at once, which is often how these numbers behave. The city then was still small enough to be walked across in a morning. Perhaps 500,000 souls, packed into narrow streets, beneath the overhanging upper stories of timber houses that leaned toward each other above the lanes. It was a city of proximity, of shared walls, shared air, shared wells. And into that closeness, the sickness moved with an old, quiet ease. The signs of it are the ones that have stayed in the English memory. A red cross painted on the door of an infected house, and beneath the cross, in the careful hand of the parish, the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." A watchman set in the street outside to keep the household within, and to fetch what was needed, and to prevent the well from leaving with the ill. There were searchers, women mostly, sent to look upon the bodies and pronounce the cause of death for the parish clerk. There were pest houses on the edges of the city. There were orders, and ordinances, and printed bills of mortality nailed up each week, so that a Londoner walking to his shop could read the tally of his neighbours, in ink, still fresh. The parish burial registers of that year show weeks in which the death rate rose so steeply that the ordinary rhythms of burial collapsed once again, as they had done in 1348, and again in the 1430s, and again in the 1560s. Each generation, it seemed, was given at least one visitation to remember by. New pits were opened outside the parish churches, in fields at the edge of the built-up ground, in corners of hospital land. Old pits, still remembered, may in some cases have been reopened. The city drew upon the same instincts it had drawn upon 3 centuries earlier. Find ground, prepare it quickly, take what comes. And what has been learned, in our own time, about the bacterium at work in that year is quietly remarkable. Genetic testing of skeletons associated with the 1665 outbreak has, in at least one study, confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis. The same organism identified in the 14th century remains beneath Charterhouse Square, 3 centuries apart. The same signature, the same small patient bacillus, sleeping in the fleas of rats, and in the folds of trade, waking now and then to walk through a European city, as if it had never left. How closely the two great outbreaks really resembled each other, the medieval Black Death and the Stuart-era Great Plague. Historians still debate. The pathogen was, we now know, the same. But the city had changed. Medicine had changed a little, though not as much as it liked to think. The way people moved and traded and gossiped and prayed had all changed. And so, though the bacterium was ancient and familiar, each visitation of the plague found a slightly different city to move through, and left a slightly different pattern of loss behind. The shape of the grief was similar. The shape of the response was similar. But the details, the streets, the parishes, the trades most struck, were their own. Picture a door in September of that year, a red cross drying on its planks, and a woman inside listening to the footsteps of the searcher moving down the street. She does not open the shutter. She knows the tread of the searcher by now, and the tread of the watchman, and the tread of the neighbor who no longer stops. Outside, the evening light is warm on the brick. Somewhere, a dog is barking. Somewhere, a child is being told to be quiet. The searcher passes. The footsteps fade. The house holds its breath a while longer, and then breathes out, and then holds its breath again. Picture a narrow lane in the small hours, and a cart in it, and the driver calling softly, "Bring out your dead." The phrase carries no drama. He has said it many nights, and it is only work now. The horse knows the route. The wheels know the ruts. A door opens. Something is brought out and laid on the boards. A coin, perhaps, changes hands, or perhaps not. The cart moves on. A window shutter clicks closed in a house that has not yet been touched. The driver rounds the corner and disappears, and the lane returns to the sound of its own gutter, and the smell of the river drifts up in the dark. Picture, too, a church bell tolling somewhere across the rooftops, and a family in a warm kitchen not lifting their heads. They have stopped counting. There is nothing to do with the count. The bell is only weather now. The candles gutter. The bread is broken. A younger child asks a question and is not answered, because the question has no answer that would help. The bell keeps on. Samuel Pepys himself wrote, in one entry, of how the sound of the passing bells had grown so continuous that he had ceased to notice them. And one hears in that sentence a very old kind of tiredness. The mind cannot mourn without pause. So it closes the shutter on the sound, and goes on eating its supper, and lets the bell become part of the evening. The pits of that year lie beneath parts of the city that have since been paved and built upon many times over. Some are known by name. Aldgate, most famously, where the diarist Daniel Defoe, writing decades later in his Journal of the Plague Year, described a great pit dug in the churchyard, and filled, layer upon layer, in the worst weeks of the outbreak. Whether Defoe wrote from memory, or from the memories of others, or from imagination stitched to record, is still argued. His book was published in 1722, well after the fact, and it reads at times like reportage, and at times like something more shaped. But the pits he described were real. The parish accounts show them. The ground beneath certain London churchyards still holds them, and even where the exact edges have been lost, the fact of them has not. There were pits at Bum Hill, and pits near Moorfields, and pits at the edges of parishes whose names have since been folded into other parishes. The city rearranged itself over them. Streets were widened, alleys were closed. Churchyards were levelled and turned into small green squares, with benches and iron railings, where office workers now eat their lunches in the pale sun, without any particular thought for the ground beneath the grass. And this is not a failure of memory exactly. It is only the way a city keeps going. The living take the surface. The dead keep the deeper layer, and the arrangement most of the time holds. Then, as with all things in this story, the outbreak passed. By the late months of 1666, the deaths were dwindling, and in the September of that year, the Great Fire took a different kind of toll on the city, sweeping through the wooden lanes and burning much of what the plague had walked among. London rebuilt in brick. It always did, and the pits, in most cases, were closed over and forgotten, tucked beneath the new foundations, tucked beneath the widened streets, tucked beneath the churches that rose again with the sound of hammers instead of bells, until, in our own century, we began to open them again. Not on purpose, not with any wish to disturb, but because the city above them kept needing new tunnels, and new stations, and new foundations for new towers, and the ground had to be gone into once more. The story of that opening is not only a story of the great excavations already spoken of. It is also a story of smaller, quieter openings, made half a century ago, when the engineers of another age drove their own line beneath the streets, and found, without quite expecting to, that they were not the first. Every time London decides to build something new, a railway, a tower, a station, a car park, it has to reckon with what is already there. Not the buildings above, the city beneath. And that city, more often than anyone quite likes to admit, is a city of the dead. It waits under the pavement in layers, patient, undisturbed for stretches of 100 years, or 200. And then, when a new project needs its foundation dug deeper than the last, it comes quietly back into view. The 1960s was such a moment. London was modernizing and the underground was extending itself once more. And the newest line then under construction was called the Victoria Line, threaded from Walthamstow in the north, down through the heart of the city, and out toward Brixton in the south. It was, at the time, the newest underground line in the world, built with the newest tunneling techniques, and its engineers were justly proud of the precision of the work. They did not, on the whole, expect to become archaeologists. But at several points along the route, when the boring machines and the digging crews cut down into the London clay at the depth the new tunnels required, they came into contact with older burial grounds, and with what appear to have been plague-era pits, quietly present beneath streets that had long since forgotten them. The remains were recorded and respectfully removed, and the works continued. There were no headlines. There rarely are, when the city is trying to open a new line on schedule and the country is watching for the ribbon cutting rather than the ledger of bones. The engineers of that decade were not indifferent to what they found. They simply worked within the customs of their time, which were quieter than ours, and less inclined to pause the machinery for a full account of the ground. What was written down in reports that most Londoners never read, filed in offices that most Londoners never entered, and the line opened, and the trains ran, and the city moved on. It was not the first time such a thing had happened. In the 1830s, during earlier construction works in the growing capital, at least one massive burial site was partially excavated, revealing what appeared to be layered burials from more than one plague period, though the details, at this distance, are patchy, and much of what was recovered then was recovered without the care a modern excavation would bring. Some of it was reburied elsewhere, some of it was lost, and some of it, one imagines, simply stayed in the clay a little way off from where it had first been laid, moved a few yards to the side by the shovel of a Victorian navvy who had a job to finish before dark. The modern practice is different. When Crossrail began its long work in the 21st century, archaeologists were embedded in the project from the outset, and every significant find was documented and photographed and catalogued, and passed into the care of the Museum of London. J. Carver and his colleagues took as much interest in the layer of bones as in the layer of clay above them. The finds at Charterhouse Square were handled that way, and at other, smaller sites along the line, wherever a shaft or a station box went deep enough to meet the older ground, the same slow, careful pattern held. The general pattern is now well established. Dig deep enough in central London, in the right places, and you will find the dead. Not always in dramatic numbers. Sometimes just a handful of ordinary parish burials that no one had thought to map. Sometimes many, ranked as they were placed centuries ago, wrapped in the pale outlines of shrouds long since gone. The Crossrail project alone unearthed thousands of skeletons across its route, most of them ordinary Londoners of centuries past. A smaller fraction plague victims, all of them people who had lived within a few miles of where they now lay. There is a quieter version of this story that some Londoners tell, and it is worth holding gently, because it belongs more to folk's suspicion than to record. It is said, in the softer conversations of pubs and building sites, that not every plague find makes the news. That when a small developer strikes bones in a foundation trench, the discovery is sometimes noted, sometimes reported, and sometimes handled more quietly, so as not to unsettle a neighborhood or slow a project already running late. There is no real evidence of any large-scale hiding of finds. Modern archaeological law in England is quite specific about what must be reported and to whom. But the suspicion lingers, in the way such suspicions do, and it feeds the sense that beneath certain new buildings, the workers know something they do not quite say aloud. It is easier, perhaps, to picture the older scenes than to argue with the newer ones. A tunnel-boring machine of the 1960s, enormous and chugging, its cutting head grinding forward inch by patient inch, spitting London clay onto a conveyor belt that runs back into the darkness of the finished tunnel. The clay is grey and damp, and it moves in a steady band of pale grey light under the work lamps, and the men who watch the belt watch it without really watching it, the way a person watches a river. And then on the belt, occasionally a pale, curved fragment that is not clay. Something too smooth, something too shaped, something that has to be lifted off and set aside and looked at properly before the belt moves on. Or an engineer in a hard hat crouching at the tunnel wall in a moment of quiet, when the crew has stopped for tea and the machine has been idled and the tunnel is filled with that particular underground stillness, warm and close and slightly metallic. He holds what he thinks at first is a piece of chalk, picked out of the wall where his glove brushed it, and slowly, in the beam of his torch, he realizes it is not chalk. It is thinner than chalk and lighter, and it curves in a way that chalk does not curve. He sets it down where he found it. He tells the foreman, and the work for a little while becomes something other than what it was. Or a modern archaeologist at Crossrail in the 2010s, working under floodlights beneath a busy street, her radio quiet on the ground beside her, her trowel moving in careful strokes across a surface that is half soil and half something else. Above her, muffled by the depth of clay and concrete and pavement, the ordinary city goes about its business. Buses pass. A siren rises and falls. Someone laughs, briefly, at a bus stop. She does not hear these things clearly. She hears her own breathing, and the small scrape of the trowel, and the low hum of the lights. She lifts a fragment, brushes it, sets it into a tray. She writes down where it came from. She notes the depth. She takes a photograph. It is patient work, and unhurried, and it does not resemble at all the drama that people at street level might imagine is happening beneath their feet. In this way, over decades the finds have accumulated. A pit noted here, a cluster there, a layer along one side of a shaft, a single skeleton at the edge of a foundation trench. The city keeps a running account of them now, though the account is not something most citizens ever look at. It is enough, for most, to know that the account exists, and that when the ground is opened, someone is watching, and that the pale curves on the conveyor belt are not simply carried away into the dark. So the dead are found, and once they are found, someone has to decide what to do with them, and someone has to tell the public what it all means, and what it does not mean, and what the ground has really said, and what the ground has not. And that duty, in our time, has fallen to a small number of unusually calm scientists, whose work is quieter than the tunneling machines, and quieter than the headlines, and whose task in the end is to say out loud, in ordinary language, the things the ground has said. I want to spend some time now with the scientists themselves, not with their findings, which we have already touched, and not with the shafts and the trenches and the pale curves on the conveyor belts, but with the way they spoke about the findings. Because what they said and did not say, and how they said it, tells us something quietly important about how to hold this whole story in the mind without letting it grow larger or darker than it needs to be. Among those involved in the Museum of London's work on the Crossrail was an osteologist named Don Walker. His job, and the job of his colleagues, was to study the bones, to lay them out on clean paper, to measure them in millimeters, to establish where possible age at death, and sex, and general health, and any signs of disease or injury, or old healed fractures that spoke of a life lived before the illness came. It is patient work, and it is quiet work, and it is not the kind of work that produces headlines. It is the kind of work that produces spreadsheets, and catalogues, and long reports read by very few people, and occasionally sentences of extraordinary calm. Because Walker and his colleagues, in the years after the shaft at Charterhouse Square was opened, and after the bones from the 1440s were lifted into the light, were asked again and again by journalists and by ordinary people whether the discoveries posed any risk, whether the bones themselves might be dangerous, whether opening a plague pit might, in some way that no one quite wanted to name, release the plague. It is not a foolish question. It is an old fear, and it lives near the surface of the imagination, and it belongs to a very long tradition of stories in which the dead carry with them the thing that killed them. And so the scientists were asked, and asked again, and the answers had to be given in ordinary language, without alarm and without condescension, and without pretending the fear was not real. Walker's answer, quoted in coverage of the Crossrail work, was direct and quiet. He said, and this is very close to his exact words, that it is not something that stays in the soil. You have to actually meet someone who has it in order to catch it. That was all. A short sentence. A shorter sentence than the question deserved, perhaps, but a truer one than a longer answer might have been. And the message from the archaeologists and the geneticists working on the London pits in the years since has been consistent. The fingerprint in the enamel, the fragments recovered from teeth, 600 and 700 years old, is exactly that, a fingerprint. Fragmented, broken, dead, incapable of infection. The bacterium, in its living form, did not survive the death of its hosts. It cannot survive centuries in clay. Whatever killed these people died with them, long ago, in the beds and the streets, and the crowded rooms of a city that no longer exists. What scientists found beneath London's plague pits, in other words, was not danger. It was information. It was a story preserved in enamel and bone, patient and silent, waiting for instruments delicate enough to read it. And the unease people feel, standing on a pavement above a known pit, or watching a documentary about a shaft opened beneath a square, is not scientific unease. It is something older than science. It is the ordinary human response to standing above the dead. And yet the folk uneasiness continues. People still on some level worry that disturbing an old plague pit is disturbing something more than soil. The scientists, in their gentle way, disagree. The folklore, in its own gentle way, persists. Both, it seems fair to say, are telling the truth about something. The science is telling us what is not there. There is no living pathogen in the London clay. There is no seed of the 14th century waiting to bloom. There is nothing in the ground, in the strict biological sense, that can reach up and take hold of a living person. The folklore is telling us something else. It is telling us how it feels to walk over a place where thousands are buried. It is telling us that a city built on top of its own dead carries a kind of weight in the imagination that no laboratory result quite removes. Both are worth listening to. Neither cancels the other. You can picture, if you like, one of the press conferences at which these things were explained. A modest room in a museum building, or in a university lecture hall. A projector screen. A few rows of chairs. A scientist in a soft, dark jumper, standing not at a podium, but slightly to one side of the screen, explaining, without drama, what a tooth can hold for 700 years. Slides advance. A diagram of a molar in cross-section. A photograph of a pit in situ. A map of London with small dots showing where the finds have come from. The scientist speaks in complete sentences and pauses often, and the room is warm, and no one raises their voice. Or you can picture the laboratory itself, the clean light of a bench. A single fragment of medieval jawbone lying on a paper card. A woman in blue nitrile gloves recording its measurements in millimeters, writing the numbers by hand in a notebook before entering them into a database. The room smells faintly of the alcohol used to clean the surfaces, and of paper, and of the electrical warmth of the machines that read the fragments of ancient code. There is no drama here. There is only care. The care of someone who understands that the object under her hands was once a person, and that the measurements she is taking are, in a very small way, that person's last statement about themselves. And you can picture, too, the moment at the press conference when a journalist raises a hand. Not aggressively, just carefully, and asks, on behalf of everyone who has ever walked home past a churchyard at dusk, whether people should be afraid, whether the city should be afraid, whether opening these places is wise. And the scientist answers, gently, no, not of this, not now. The dead cannot make us ill. The ground has been quiet for a long time. What we are doing when we lift these bones into the light is listening to them, not waking them. It is a very English scene in a way. The soft jumper, the polite question, the measured answer. No one shouts, no one demands. The knowledge is passed from one person to another in ordinary language, over ordinary chairs, and afterwards there is tea, and people go back to their offices, and the bones go back into their carefully labelled boxes, and the city, unaware, goes on. There is a small comfort in this, if you let yourself feel it. The dead of the 1665 plague, and of the earlier 14th century catastrophe, and of all the quieter dyings in between, are not held now in fear. They are held in catalogues. They are described in millimeters. Their teeth have given up their secrets in laboratories where the light is even and the gloves are clean. This is not disrespect. It is, in its own strange way, the opposite of disrespect. It is attention. It is a very slow, very patient attention, of a kind the living rarely receive, and the long dead almost never do. So the science is calm. The bones are catalogued. The DNA is sequenced. The fragments read. The findings written up in journals with long titles and small print. The reports are filed. The interviews are given. The soft jumpers are folded away at the end of the day. And after all of that, after the shafts and the trenches and the papers and the press conferences and the careful sentences given to careful journalists, there remains one more question that the science alone cannot answer. What does London actually do in the end, with all these people it has lifted out of the ground? Where do they go once they have been counted, and measured, and studied, and understood as well as they are going to be understood? The bones cannot simply stay in the boxes forever. Somewhere a decision has to be made. Somewhere a place has to be chosen. And the choice that has been made in our own time is a quiet one, and it involves a small piece of land in the river itself, and it is worth walking towards slowly. The last part of this story is the part that gets the least attention. It is not dramatic. It does not make headlines. There are no press releases, no long articles in the Sunday papers, no television crews with careful lighting and careful questions. But it is, I think, the gentlest part of the whole long account, and it is worth sitting with in the middle of the night, when the city outside is quiet and the story is nearly done. Because once the archaeologists have finished, and once the osteologists have finished, and once the laboratories have read whatever the enamel of the teeth still had to say, there remains the very old question of what to do next. The bones cannot stay forever on shelves. The cardboard boxes, however carefully labelled, are not a resting place. So somewhere, at some point, a quiet decision is made. A place is chosen. A day is set, and the people who were lifted out of the ground are returned to it. Many of the remains from the Crossrail excavations, along with remains from other modern London digs, were carefully reburied after study. A significant number of them were interred on an island in the Thames, a small piece of land in the river itself, chosen for its dignity and for its distance from the noise of the streets and the trains and the cranes. It is not a famous place. Most Londoners could not point to it on a map. That is, in a sense, the point of it. It is somewhere the traffic does not reach, and the tourists do not gather, and the ground is allowed simply to be ground again. The reburials were conducted with ceremony. In most cases, the ceremony was Christian, because that was the tradition of the people involved when they lived in the 14th century and in the 17th, and it seemed only right to send them back the way they had first expected to go. A priest was present with a book. Members of the archaeological teams were present, in dark coats, standing a little apart, hands folded. In some cases, members of the public came too, ordinary Londoners who had followed the story in the newspapers, and felt, without quite being able to explain why, that they would like to be there when it was finished. Picture the scene for a moment, gently, from a small distance. An island in the Thames, on a grey morning. The water flat and metallic, moving slowly. The distant hum of the modern city carried across the surface, softened by the water into something almost like weather. A small group of figures standing near a fresh opening in the earth. A coffin, or in some cases, a series of small ossuary boxes, being lowered without hurry. The priest reading. Someone else, perhaps, holding a folded piece of paper against the breeze. And the mist coming in low across the river, moving between the reeds at the water's edge, so that the far bank fades and the near bank sharpens, and the whole ceremony feels a little like a photograph developing in slow chemistry. Somewhere upstream or downstream, a distant church bell marks the hour. It is a very ordinary sound, and a very old one, and it is the sound that would have marked the hour when these same people were first laid down, 7 centuries before, in a different kind of hurry, in a different kind of ground. Now the bell is only the bell. It does not mean an emergency. It does not mean another cart at the gate. It marks time in the way bells have always marked time, when nothing in particular is wrong. The bones that had lain beneath a garden square in Farringdon for 700 years, and that had been lifted, briefly, into fluorescent light and cardboard trays, and the clean geometry of laboratory benches, were placed back into the earth. It was not the same earth. It could not be. The medieval soil of Charterhouse Square is now sealed under paving and roots and services, and the memory of a station. But it was earth, and it was quiet, and it was chosen with care. The reburial did not undo the excavation. Nothing undoes an excavation. The knowledge stayed where it had been made. The published papers remained in their journals, with their long titles and small print. The DNA sequences remained in databases. The measurements, in millimeters and grams, remained in the files. Even photographs of the bones, taken from above under even lighting, remained on hard drives in offices across the city. All of that was kept, but the people themselves, as much as they could still be called that, were returned. The knowledge stayed above ground, the bones went back below. This pattern is not universal. Some remains stay in archives, in study collections, so that new questions, when they are eventually asked, will have something to be asked of. A tooth kept in a drawer today may answer, in 50 years, a question no one has yet thought to pose. That, too, is a form of care. But the general pattern in London now, the accepted approach among the archaeologists and the osteologists and the institutions that oversee them, is this: study and then rebury. Many of the people involved have spoken of it as a matter of quiet ethical seriousness. Not a rule imposed from outside, but a habit of conscience that has settled into the profession as the years have gone by. There is something, though, we may never quite settle about all of this, and it is worth admitting as we sit here in the low light. It is not clear whether the reburial is really for the dead, or whether it is for us. It is not clear whether the people whose teeth still carried the fingerprint of the plague, 700 years after their breath had gone still, would care, in any way we could understand, where their bones ended up. They cannot be asked. They left no instructions on this particular point. So we do the thing that seems most gentle. We put them somewhere quiet. We say some words. We stand for a moment on damp grass with our hands folded. And then we walk away, back to the launch, back to the far bank, back to the trains and the offices, and the tea, and the river closes softly behind us. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps ceremony is not really a message sent to the dead at all, but a message the living need to send to themselves. A way of marking that a thing has been finished properly, that the story has been closed with the kind of respect its length deserves. If that is so, then the island in the Thames is doing exactly what it was chosen to do. It is a place where London, having lifted its long-buried people up into the daylight for a while, sets them down again, and does so slowly, and does so on purpose. The mist thickens a little on the water. The last of the small group walks back down the path. The reeds move and settle. The bell finishes its hour, and the sound folds itself away into the air over the river, and the island is left alone with its new residents, who are also its very old residents, and who now at last have somewhere to be. That is the shape of the modern story, more or less. The digging, the study, the science, the sober faces in the soft jumpers, and then at the end of it all the small ceremony on the small island, and the earth closing back over. It is a story that begins in emergency and ends in patience. It is a story that begins in fear and ends in something very close to tenderness, though no one involved would use that word out loud. But there is one thread I would like to hold up before we let the whole thing go for the night. It is the strangest thread, and the quietest, and it is the one that tends to stay with people who think about London's plague pits for any length of time. It is not about the pits we have found. It is not about the shafts, or the trenches, or the neatly numbered skeletons in their neatly numbered boxes. It is about the ones we have not found. It is about how many of them there really are, out there beneath the paving, and under the parks, and below the ordinary basements of ordinary houses. And it is worth walking towards very slowly indeed. There is a way of looking at London that is not the way you usually look at London. In this way of looking, you do not see the buildings, or the streets, or the traffic, or the bright signs, or the shop fronts, or the buses turning at the lights. You see, instead, everything that is under them. You see the pipes, and the cables, and the old brick sewers, and the tube tunnels curving through the clay. And beneath all of that, quieter than all of that, you see the pale shapes. A scattering of them, some in rows, some in clusters, some alone, layered at different depths, by different centuries, in different silences. And in that view, London is not one city. It is two. One walks about in the daylight, and the other lies very still beneath it, and has been lying still for a very long time. The historians and the museum people have been careful about this, in the way they are careful about everything. Historic UK, the Museum of London, the academic surveys, they all say roughly the same thing in roughly the same measured tone. The plague pits of London are more numerous and more widely distributed than the surviving maps can quite show. Some are famous. The ground at Charterhouse Square, the trenches at East Smithfield ordered by King Edward III, the long crowded stratum of Bedlam beneath Liverpool Street. These are the ones with names. These are the ones that appear in the guidebooks and the museum panels. But the named pits are only the pits we happen to know about. Others are attested only in parish records, or in the memoirs of clergymen, or in the offhand notes of Victorian antiquarians who noticed something interesting while a house was being built and jotted it down in a letter to a friend. Others are known only in fragments. A single bone found by a workman in the 1890s and quietly reburied. A rumour attached to a particular garden in a particular square. A bend in a road that historians have long suspected was drawn, in some older century, to avoid something the mapmakers did not wish to name. The ground at Charterhouse itself, we now know, was used across two entirely different plague periods. 3 centuries apart, the earlier dead lying beneath the later dead in the same patient soil. Similar reuse almost certainly happened in other places, though the records for those places are patchier, and in some cases the records simply are not there at all. And then, layered over all of the plague grounds, there are the ordinary parish burial grounds. Hundreds of them, across the medieval and early modern city. Some are still marked, still fenced, still recognizable as churchyards with their yew trees and their leaning stones. Some were paved over long ago and became small squares, or car parks, or the paths behind office buildings, or the courtyards of blocks of flats that no one thinks of as anything but blocks of flats. The scientists, again, have been careful with the numbers. There is no reliable total. There may never be. But the qualitative statement stands, and it stands very quietly. London is built extensively on its dead, and here is the quietest thing of all. When people talk about London's plague pits, and when they wonder what scientists have really found beneath them, I think what unsettles them is not any single pit. It is not Charterhouse, or East Smithfield, or Bedlam. It is the sense, vague, almost unformed, that we do not know quite how many there are, that some are still down there, unopened, that some lie beneath buildings whose foundations happen to have missed them by a matter of feet, that every so often a workman in a trench in a quiet part of the city puts down a spade for a moment, and looks at what he has just uncovered, and calls his supervisor, and the supervisor calls the museum, and another small chapter of the invisible city is added to the map. It is not alarming, this thought. It is only large. It is possible, the historians tell us, that a Londoner may live an entire life on a street directly over an old pit and never know. It is possible that every time you have walked across certain squares, Charterhouse, or Aldgate, or others less commonly named, you have been walking over people who died in a summer so long ago that the leaves that fell on them that year are 10 meters of layered earth beneath the pavement now. This is not a threat. It is only a fact. The city we walk on is older than we usually let ourselves imagine. This is, I think, what the old folklore of cursed wells was reaching towards in its own way. The tales, hedged now as tales, of a well in a village on the road, and dark water at the bottom of it, and pale shapes half glimpsed if you looked long enough. The stories that warn children not to lean over the mossy rim. It is easy to dismiss these as country superstition, and much of the specific content probably is. But underneath the superstition there is a folk-poetic recognition of the same feeling the modern city gives when you think about it too carefully at night. The ground remembers. The ground holds. What went down does not entirely go away, though what it becomes is only memory. And here, gently, is where the reassurance returns, because it should. Don Walker at the Museum of London, and the osteologists who work beside him, have said it many times, in that quiet voice they use for questions they know unsettle people. Whatever it was, it died with them. The pathogen did not linger in the soil. The clay does not carry it. Only the memory does. Whatever else the invisible city holds, it does not hold danger. It holds only company. So what, in the end, have the scientists really found beneath London's plague pits? They have found bones. They have found teeth. They have found coffin nails, and pieces of pottery, and buttons, and the small ordinary things that fall from ordinary lives. They have found DNA, and with it the name and shape of a pathogen that had been anonymous for 600 years. They have found rows of Londoners laid down, in the great emergencies, with more care than the panic of the moment should have allowed. Children placed between adults, hands folded, heads oriented east. They have found numbers larger than the eye can gently hold, and depths deeper than the imagination easily accepts. And, quieter than all of the rest of it, they have found the sense that the city has been keeping something for a very long time. Not a danger. A company. The dead as neighbours. The dead as ground. If you were to draw a cross-section of London, seen from an imagined side view, you would draw the towers first, and the terraces, and the low grey shops. You would draw the streets, and the buses, and the trees along them. You would draw the tube lines curving in their deep tunnels, and the pipes, and the wires, and the old brick sewers still doing their patient work. And then, at various depths, at various angles, scattered through the clay and the gravel, and the London earth, you would draw the pale shapes. Not many in some places, a great many in others, layered by century, layered by parish, layered by the different summers in which they arrived. You would draw them small, and you would draw them softly, because that is the scale they occupy now. And on the surface, in a garden at dusk, in one of those old squares, no one in it, the light going blue, the leaves not quite still, you might sit on a bench for a moment and feel without alarm the sense of many people close by, unseen, unhurried, entirely at rest. It is only a sense. It proves nothing. But it is the sense the city gives, if you are quiet enough to notice it. And somewhere, at the edge of that same feeling, is the old thumbnail image the folktales kept alive. A mossy rim, dark water, pale shapes half glimpsed at the bottom. Not a threat, just a keeping. A very long, very patient keeping. And that, I think, is where we can begin to let this go for the night. Not with a conclusion, not with an answer, only with the quiet sense of a city that has been holding a great many people for a great many years, and is content, in its old and unhurried way, to keep holding them. The Black Death is nearly 700 years behind us now. The Great Plague of 1665 is more than 3 centuries behind us. The people who dug the trenches are gone. The people who laid the small bodies between the larger ones are gone. The children tucked into the gaps have passed into a form of memory that is not quite memory, because no one alive remembers them. The kings who arranged the burial grounds are gone. The grave diggers are gone. The archaeologists who first opened the tunnels beneath the Victoria Line are, most of them, gone as well. Even the modern scientists who first read the fingerprint in the enamel will, one day, be gone. All of it is very far away from the room you are in now, very far from the warm shape of your bed, from the pillow under your head, from the small, quiet sounds of your own house at this hour of the night. The ground is holding all of it, calmly, and has been for a very long time, and will go on holding it long after any of us has finished being awake. You do not have to remember any of the names. Most of the names, in truth, are not even known. You do not have to remember the year the sickness arrived, or the depth of the shaft at Charterhouse, or the strain of the bacterium, or the island in the Thames where the modern reburials were quietly done. You do not have to hold on to a single fact from this whole long night. It is all still there. The bones are still there. The papers are still there. The city is still there. Everything we have spoken of will keep, whether you remember it or not. So you can let it drift now. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. You can let the voice go quiet in your ears without following it. You can let the room dissolve at its edges. There is nothing here you need to guard, and nothing here you need to solve. The dead have been at rest for centuries, and they are asking nothing of you. Sleep is not failure here. Sleep is the point. Somewhere in London, at this exact hour, a light is on in an office window above a garden square. Somewhere else, a train is passing beneath a station, empty of passengers. Somewhere else again, a small island in the Thames is dark under a grey sky, and the reeds are moving in a wind you cannot hear from where you are. And somewhere at the edge of all of it, in the old folk imagination, a mossy rim, dark water, a patient keeping. All of it is there. All of it will still be there in the morning. And so gently from wherever this finds you, Adelaide, or Ohio, or Glasgow, or somewhere I could not begin to guess, sleep well. The ground is patient. The dead are patient. And the voice, if you need it, will keep going for a little while longer.